Yeah, we can start.
Yes. So I'm Rohit Muzumdar. Welcome everyone to the third panel of day one of our undergraduate research dissertation symposium for this year. The third panel is titled as of mobilities and publics. And we have with us three discussants on this panel. Sarovar Zaidi, Vishwanath Kashikar, and Kush Patel. Sarovar Zaidi is assistant professor at the Jindal School of Art and Architecture. Vishwanath Kashikar is an associate professor at the Faculty of Architecture, SEPT. And Kush Patel is associate professor at the Avni Institute of Design. Our presenters on this session are Ashi Choldia, Abhinav Pade, and Ankita Teli. Okay, just to kind of give you a quick introduction to this panel. Mobility or streets as conduits of mobility in normative understandings are kind of conceptualized through the idea of efficient circulation, whether it is of people, vehicles, or goods. Now, underlying that, there is also a simultaneous conceptualization, which is of the public. And the idea of the public in understanding, in this understanding of efficiency, is a singular universal one, that relationships of all individuals of this public community are to streets, and their experiences of mobility are the same for all individuals. This panel starts from suspending that assumption. And all the three presenters today explore streets and mobility in suspending this through different lenses. Ashi Choldia's work looks at the production of commons in the street, and she specifically emphasizes on the fact that they are produced as urban practices, and there is a spatiality to them. Abhinav Pade looks at the relationship between mobility and urban experience, and he tries to explore whether and how, if individuals move at different kinds of speed, does it change the spatial experience of the city? And if so, how does it do that? Ankita Teli takes on a third tack altogether. Her work is located along highways, more particularly in Sindhudurg, and she looks at how people owning properties and how people inhabiting the edges of highways experience the ongoing change when a highway is built adjoining a rural settlement. So these are our three presenters. I welcome all the three of you, as well as our respondents and all the audience. With that, I would like to invite Ashi Choldia first to start the presentation, followed by Abhinav and then Ankita Teli. So Abhinav, after Ashi finishes, you can start your presentation, and then Ankita. Yeah?
Is my screen visible? Yes, Ashi.
Yeah, Ashi. Yeah. Please.
Oh,
Hi. The politics of commons. I enjoy a sense of freedom in open shared places beyond the confines of the house. These places are resources shared.
Ashi,
The notes are seen and your slide has become small.
Oh,
you need to get out of the presenter view, Ashi.
is this proper?
Yes,
Yeah.
it's working perfect.
Sharing the entire screen. So right now you can see the presentation only, right?
Yes,
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 yes.
perfect. Don't worry.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I'll start again. The politics of commons. I enjoy a sense of freedom in open shared places beyond the confines of the house. These places are resources shared by a collective and inhabited through the practices of the everyday. Therefore, it is the blurry ownerships that produce the experience of openness. The term commons refers to open resources that are shared among the public. Urban commons have been spoken of by cultural theorists such as Garrett Hardin in his book Tragedy of Commons, where he makes an economical argument and talks about the impossibility of sharing resources. He talks about how resources can be prevented from depletion or ruin by allowing resources to be privatized or by having an administrative law. Whereas Eleanor Ostrom, through a book Governing the Commons, challenges the tragedy of commons and makes a critical argument that Hardin's example is a very small scale example. The management of commons which occur differs in different scales, hence, there can never be a common solution to all. What looks like a good way to resolve problems at one scale might be problematic for some other scale. Very few theorists speak of the idea of urban commons, and even when they do so, they speak through simplistic relationships. There's a binary through which the idea of commons is spoken about. My experience of commons, on the other hand, reveals them as deeply contested spaces. The thesis argues that commons has its own politics through which its spaces are negotiated. Closer scrutiny is able to uncover the contested ways in which the commons get divided and the ways in which it allows and restricts certain practices by claimants and the resulting spatial manifestations of these claims. Therefore, the question that emerges is how do commons lend themselves to be appropriated by individuals who come together to practice their everyday? The thesis research refers closely to Henry Lefebvre's production of space, and where he talks about the three kinds of spaces: the perceived space, lived space, and the conceived space, and James Gibson's theory of affordances. The processes that produce an experience were realized through Prasad Shetty and Rupali Gupte's idea of transactional capacity and my own personal experiences of commons. For the sake of the research, the dissertation clarifies the following terms. Negotiation is a process of occupying and inhabiting a shared place. Sharing happens when every individual, according to their own desires, start appropriating a space through the process of negotiation. Appropriation is the manifestation of an individual desire, which is negotiated with the form of the place and others who inhabit it. Claim, on the other hand, is an assertion of desire of an individual against the other through the practice of inhabitation. Appropriating and claiming a space depends on the capacity a space holds. Affordance is what the space lets you do in it, what it offers you. The configuration of space affects the affordance of space. A street is a form of a shared resource that affords inhabitation. It is able to absorb and fold people into multiple activities. The thesis also argues that commons is something more than the use value and has an experiential dimension. As people move out of their own dwelling units and reach out to the spaces on the outside, they tend to. Can you all hear me?
Yes, yes.
I got a notification that my internet connection is unstable. Sorry. As people move out of their dwelling units and reach out to the spaces on the outside, they tend to create networks. The commons become a space that holds these meshes of networks, which come to define the experience of any participant in the space. Since politics of commons is layered and is not a binary, it is difficult to convey its complexities in simple cartographic terms. Therefore, the drawing is a work which allows us to look at spaces, conversations, and conflicts simultaneously. The form of the research has been through dialogical scripts. Miniature drawing narratives are also referred, which helped me to structure the drawings, the layers of the space. The study opens up the nuances of commons by analyzing 5 different streets of Malad, Mumbai, with different institutions such as a school, temple, hospital, local markets, masjid, etc. A minority, sorry. A minority community has been staying here for more than 4 decades. The religious structure with a school here is a bounded structure and it dictates how the claims are going to happen around it. The boundaries of the structure have been redefined over the years because of the insecurities which are produced through the stigma which comes from the people who are living in these residential buildings over here. The street holds a tension between two different groups which are caused because of the differences between religions and class. Because of the boundaries of the religious structure, which is so apparent, the people from the informal settlements are able to fully claim the space. The nature of the informal settlement here is boundaryless, which affords economical transactions, which is the library, the print shop, and the tailor. Hence, it helps to break the ghettoization which already exists. A lot of men and teenagers are found loitering around throughout the day. The religious structure here, that's the mandir, does not have a very clear, rigid boundary. Hence, it allows appropriation. Hence, it allows its surroundings to be appropriated. The informal settlements, whose nature is very boundaryless, is able to afford economical transactions. The street is dominated by the people living in the informal settlement on one side, and by the residential people on the other side. Here, the curve allows the appropriation to happen. The curve segregates the street into two different spaces, and hence allows to appropriate the space fully. In the economic activities such as the fruit seller who sits for some hours, the lady who sells flowers in the morning outside the temple, a small boy who sells food for the cows, they create pauses for the residents staying around. Hence, it generates spaces for negotiations to happen. The transactions along the edge of the street, the steps allow secondary streets to be formed and multiple layers to be formed, which are the private shop, then these steps, then the vegetable sellers, then the hawkers who are there. And at night, there are people who sleep outside the same shops which are shut. So the shopkeepers association create lobbies, these in between lobbies, which further create in between spaces which allow people to take pauses. The shopkeepers negotiate with the vendor and make them sit in a way which for and there are steel poles which have been built by the people of the residential buildings which further become anchor points and they are reappropriated. The post office here has created restrictions to the economic transactions by building planters in front of a few compound walls. These redefined partitions cause accumulation of garbage, which further causes parking to happen throughout the day. It allows people to relax on the cars. It is a men-dominated space because of the existence of a pan shop and a wine shop at the junction, which allows a lot of loitering to happen at the junction itself. The city and therefore commons are contested between the differences of class, caste, religion, and gender. It is the transactional capacity of the form of urban commons that resolves these tensions by blurring boundaries that are drawn through these differences, through the appropriation and rearticulation of claims that happen through the politics of commons. The conclusion details what certain configurations of space are able to produce in the commons in terms of its transactional capacities. The dissertation finds that anonymity of spaces and blurred programs allow multiple things to happen and smudges the idea of ownership. For example, the chabutra, in the morning, the surface is used by kids to play. During the evenings, people from the informal settlement sit here and gossip there. During festivals, it is used as a platform to keep idols. Territorialization creates differentiations about who can access the space and who cannot, while also creating more spaces of pauses. A largeness of a space and a continuous long spaces allow various layers of appropriations to happen. In the arrangement of the various layers, there are several in-between spaces which are formed. For example, the junctions which are formed while the vegetable sellers sit next to each other. Hence, the commons between livelihoods afford the most transactional capacity. It allows maximum degree of temporal appropriation to happen. Junctions play an important role by creating spaces to pause and for initiating smaller conversation and discussions. There are various economic activities which are found happening at the junctions. They are the first place that the vendors start occupying since they allow a node to be formed because of which cars are made to pass at a diminished speed. A junction between 3 or 4 roads makes people walk at a slower pace because of the crossings at these nodes, and hence people tend to pause and linger alongside the shops of the street vendors, giving rise to various economic and social transactions. Compound wall partitions, even though they generate differentiation but allow another layer of appropriation to happen and allows escapes to happen. The partition wall of the residential apartment allows the chabutra to be built, which is appropriated by the people of the informal settlement. It also allows many economical transactions to happen, and at the same time for parking to happen, which further allows people to relax and sit. Dead end streets unintentionally become a major part of the everyday routine of the people to which for whom it is in the direct vicinity. Less maintained spaces are basically they are less attentive sites, and hence they allow one to loiter around and relax. The religious structure creates a ghettoization which is very apparent and is being used by a particular community. The location of the structure marks a territory for itself. It acts like a nucleus and everything around it is bounded by it. Institutional claims allow and invite appropriation to happen because the institution altogether bring up another set of activities and assumptions that are performed, and there are various temporal activities that happen because of it. At the same time, there's a stronger control of institutions over the practice of space, and they enjoy a higher hand in negotiations. Hence, this study built towards an approach of decreasing restrictions in the outdoor areas by producing imaginations of spaces which affords negotiation spaces which allow many more multiplicities to happen, finding ways to soften the existing power structures and hierarchies that they set up in accessing the commons in favor of a more egalitarian space. The city holds tension through the idea of differences in religion, class. The placement of institutions should be such that it allows to blur its own boundaries, hence allowing its surroundings to be appropriated, which further helps to break the ghettoization. I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashi. Thanks for that wonderful presentation. It was so lovely to see the drawings, and particularly, the edge and its modulation, which when it becomes an envelope and has a thickness to it, and which is not harsh and which is not hard, and that allows so many possibilities. We will kind of move to the next presentation quickly, and I'll invite Abhinav Pade to make his presentation on the spatiality of urban mobilities. Yes, Abhinav.
Hello, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
And you all can see my screen as well.
Yes.
All right.
We are on your second slide, Avina.
I'm sorry. Right. So
Yeah.
I'd like to begin with so cities in common mainstream media usually are talked about through these quotations like city in the fast lane, city that never sleeps, or cities that are always on the move. These using the usage of these words and these phrases it shows how our experience in the city or our spatiality in the city is heavily constituted by our experience of movement around us. My research dissertation tries to understand or explore this sort of relationship that the city has between mobility and its urban space. Um, the research question therefore becomes, how do contemporary mobility shape an individual's partiality and their experience of the urban everyday? So I try to start at a framework where I'm setting up a framework between networks, mobility, and spatiality. The network essentially is the city. You can look at cities as a densification of networks between people, objects, and information. And when you see that in relationship with the mobility or movement in a city, you see patterns generate. Similarly, when you see a network and spatiality sort of the dialect between a city and its spatiality, you see a manifestation of spaces. A mobility and spatiality is viewed through perception. Through setting up through multiple readings on mainly leaning on phenomenological theory and other readings on mobility and sociology. Mobility of sociology by John Urry. Uh, I also set up a theoretical framework which allows me to enter a research methodology which concentrates on looking at individuals at individuals and crowds in urban environments. The first site and my research methodology now becomes is looking at the first site as a pedestrian route and the second site as a vehicular route. Therefore, automatically differentiating between the rate of mobility. At the same time, I also realized that since I'm looking at mobility, I focus on spaces of transit in the city, essentially spaces which connect sort of two destinations and do not serve for more than just transit routes. So the first site is the road between Grant Road Station and Nana Chowk Circle. This road essentially on either side, the road on either side has a shop, and it's mainly a route of transit which connects from the junction to the station. Were you all able to see the video? I'm sorry. Were you all able to see the video?
Yes,
Yes, yes, we did.
Yeah. So from the video, I started what my research methodology became that I essentially took a point where I could actually get more access and have large access to the street and the visual access to the street, and I basically just sat and started looking at individuals on the street and started mapping or tracing their paths that they take, because I realized that most of your transaction or the way you traverse a street is through a method of path finding. So then these paths became interesting because as much as you see the street in this flux, sort of this idea which comes across, or when you're looking at it from the outside as a flux, the moment you start zooming into these singular sort of individuals on the street, you start to see patterns emerge when you map them out side by side. So this is what I did. I created a stitch of the entire site through photographs, and I took this image to site and I started drawing these paths alongside and started making notations on site. And then and through this study, I found like there are certain junctions where there is an intensification. There are certain junctions which make people slow down. However, there are also certain junctions or certain parts of the street which make people speed up. So what I did then was that the study then became a little more. It becomes a little more detailed where I start zooming in to different parts or different age groups and different genders on the street, and I look at them separately so that I can start seeing patterns, or if any patterns do emerge. For that matter. And over here, you're looking at the paths that usually younger men and women take on this path of the street. You can already see that there is this one junction between this T junction where automatically, like the dotted lines indicate the slowing down of speeds of these people, and there are these intensifications across the street as highlighted through these darker sort of areas on the street, where people usually are either their moments or their movements essentially suggest that they have looked at or they have registered that space more, or they have registered that space a little deeper compared to the remainder of the street. And the drawings essentially are trying to convey this in the form of creating this drawing in this manner which makes it look like this entire street is essentially like a cloud or a blur, where there is an intensification. However, there's also like where you also lose some information when you're walking. The point I'm trying to make is that when you are being mobile, there are certain spaces which you do forget because those spaces become blur or you register as a blur. Whereas some spaces allow you to pause and allow you to be a little more and allow you to register them a little deeper because of the qualities that they hold. Similarly, this is for middle-aged women and men, and this age group was also the most popular. I mean, they populated the street the most. Over here again, the line weights over here, the moment the lines get thinner, these routes or these paths were quicker paths where people were walking outside. So you start seeing patterns where people walking on the pavement are usually walking slower compared to people walking on the road, and people walking on the road are usually just cutting across the whole section, while people on the pavement are still interacting and they still have cues which allow for pauses. What becomes interesting is amongst all these sites is that there are a few commonalities where all these age groups and all genders are essentially pausing. An interesting sort of segment becomes like this fruit seller, which is on the street, which I started identifying in these patterns, sort of the study of pattern, like this pattern observations that I try to do is where I actually start seeing these commonalities come across. The next site is Mahalakshmi Racecourse Road. It's essentially it's a large transect in the city, which also just proves to be mainly a route of transit or a space of transit, because it's connecting Tulsi Pipe Road, which all the way to Haji Ali Junction, and alongside of either side you have Racecourse on one side, which occupies most of that side, and on the other side you mainly have just a few buildings, not commercial, and you have this bridge, the Mahalakshmi Road Station Bridge, and you come down and you have Wellington on your left side and Racecourse again on your right side, and then only to lead to Haji Ali Junction essentially. So entire route becomes a space of transit, which is why I started looking at it as my second site. What I did was I took my interviewees. So to conduct interviews or to collect data on these sites, I essentially took my interviewees across these sites. I'll just go back. So what begins happening is that because of the COVID situation, I had to take my interviewees in a car, or else, I mean, I could have looked at other forms of transport, but the car became the safest. Therefore, my way of interviewing them became taking them across this transect in a car, and again try asking them similar questions as I would have, or as I start looking at this at the city. When you do that, I asked them, while they did that, I asked them to actually take photographs from me across. So I asked them to take a minimum of 14 or 15 photographs in that whole transect, and they took these photographs. And then once the transect was over, and as a follow-up interview, I sat and actually started making these collages with them. This technique of the collage essentially came to be because I realized that when they're talking, or just through conversation, I realized that there were certain things or certain checkpoints that all of them started, or all my interviewees started noticing and identifying.
Their famous studio reminds me of Love, for sure. However, this Mahalakshmi station nowadays only reminds me of Harsh's old house. But I don't register them. I just
ब्रिज बड़ा करना चाहिए।
ब्रिज बड़ा करना चाहिए।
उसकी वजह से ट्रैफिक होता है, छोटा ब्रिज है ना।
So I was thinking to notice the road, so that in case but there was hardly anything to see. The tall buildings which are coming up, like that. Generally, when we come onto this road, we talk about those buildings only. Acha, ye itti ban gayi, haan, ye itti ban gayi, like those ones.
So my process was essentially I got them on a G-Meet call, and I sat with each of these interviewers, and I sat and made this collage alongside them from the photographs that they had taken. I did tell them that there were options of blurring these images, or they could choose to which ones they wanted to hold stationary and which ones they wanted to blur. And these were the results which actually came out, which I showed you right now. And from looking at these, I started drawing a few conclusions of how they were actually looking at the city in mobility. So my first conclusion from the study at Grant Road Station, where I'm looking at the transect as a walkthrough or a pedestrian route, I started seeing these patterns form through spatiality, where there are dead spots. So shop corners where there is no opening, or panwala shops which are situated in corners become dead spots. There are sense alterers that change the experience of space. Therefore, your mobile phones or someone carrying a heavy bag walks and navigates the street in a very different way compared to the remainder. You start seeing that these open shops that happen, like the fruit seller, for example, is an open shop, and these open shops hold more attention in the sense anyone passing by has access to, or can quickly buy or interact with the person, and they can continue their journey in transit. There are attention grabbers on the street, so shops which are better lit, or shops which become more which have a interesting sort of hoarding, or any signage on the street becomes an attention grabber. Then pavement conditions start affecting the way you navigate the street. So if there's a parking issue, you always will have to basically go around it. So essentially these spaces become these spaces of negotiations where you as an individual negotiate with the entire street. And these spaces in the street essentially become or seem like they are the spaces where these pauses get created, and this negotiation can actually happen, where you can actually negotiate the space to hold a moment of pause. So to conclude, I can't say that I'm concluding anything. It's more like an observation or a learning. Is that at lower speeds you traverse the city while negotiating its spaces, so that you allow yourself to have a pause. It's essentially on a street where you're moving across, your spatiality becomes a spatiality of negotiations. And these negotiations are essentially to allow for the body to hold or create a pause. While at higher speeds, the city registers as a blur, and it's more of an experience which is extrinsic, in the sense that you're viewing it from the outside, and you view the outside as and you view view it as an object in flux. And when I say an object in flux, I mean that the city is performing itself apart from or distance from you, and therefore you see it in this blur. However, your only sense of orientation comes from like these identifiers or commonplace knowledge which everyone holds, and therefore those conversations or those snippets which I actually got from my interviews help me understand how people are orienting themselves in the city while they actually register it as a blur. I'd like to conclude here.
Thanks, Abhinav. So if Ashi was focusing on how commons were produced by people inhabiting them, Abhinav was focusing on how people or passers-by experience streets. I'll invite Ankita Teli to make the final presentation. Yeah, welcome.
Yeah. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
So the question from in the backdrop of the emerging urbanization shaped by the construction of new highways and expansion of existing highways in India. The Golden Quadrilateral was the project of connecting 4 cities, metropolitan cities in India. After this expansion, many highways started after this, the expansion of many highways started in India. So Kokad is a coastal plain of Western India situated between the Arabian Sea and Western Ghat. It is a combination of metropolitan cities and rural areas, and it is connected by the National Highway, that is NH66, Mumbai-Goa National Highway. There are 3 ways in which urbanists have discussed such a transformation. The first, where the disposition of land acquisition leads to the challenge of collective actions. The second is the formation of collective institutions to establish shareholder city. And third is, on the other hand, architecture always posed questions of vernacular and identity. I explore my research question in Tarare village. It's in Concurrently Tehsil and Sindhudurga district, along Mumbai-Goa National Highway. The highway urbanization here led to many social and economic changes. Given the context of COVID-19, I conducted audio and video interviews of people who have land along the highway to understand household configuration, livelihood, and spatiality of each property before and after the expansion of the highway. The narrative of ongoing change is structured as a story of spatiality before the expansion of the highway and after the expansion of the highway. So this is the case where the house is at the back and workspace is in the front. So there was a restaurant along the highway and there were shops in front of the highway. So the good connectivity over here allowed many transactions to happen. The hawkers from the Tuesday market used to set up their stalls over here, and children used all the space to play. After the highway expansion, as the family grew, people started developing cattle shed into houses. The owner of the restaurant thought it is an opportunity for him to expand his business, so he has built a hotel. Because of this hotel, the house behind the hotel is facing a light and ventilation problem. There is a drinking water well over here. It's because of the highway expansion. Uh, there is a contaminated water, which is now entering into a drinking water well. This is the second case where the owner had a gift shop in his farmlands and two rental shops in the same village on another plot. And all the plots around this plot are the agricultural plots. So because the good connectivity over here allowed this shop to run smoother. After the highway expansion, when the two shops which were earlier on a rent was demolished, this owner is starting to build a new commercial building on the agricultural land. So this is the plot which is near the highway, which belongs to the another person, and currently he is doing agricultural over here. But in future, if this person develops this plot, then it will result into blocking the connectivity of the highway with this building. So here the question comes is that what would be an adaptive reuse of this building? This is the third case where owner has a house behind and two shops, rental shops in front, and there is a chawl in between. After the highway expansion, the two rental shops were demolished, and the chawl, which was earlier accommodated by migrants, workers, and teachers, is now in a dilapidated state. So there is no income source for him. So he is also thinking to build a commercial building on his plot like other villages. These are the similar cases I'll take you through. On the other hand, there are these agrarian land owners who are converting their plots to non-agricultural plots and waiting for the property distribution amongst the family so that they can build a commercial building over here. Based on these case studies, I came to conclusion with three arguments. First, is the highway expansion here lead to the programmatic type of a building in a village, such as hotels and shopping centers. Household members are speculating their future based on their properties. They build structures when they are not completely sure of the profit that anticipated future will bring. The new buildings type which is emerging in a village is need to think in a context of uncertainty and anticipation in the economic flux. The third is that new building type from along the highway which neither respond to the fast moving traffic nor to the commons, and even the construction of the new buildings might create a new opportunity for the adjacent plots. This poses a question for architects who have largely focused on the village as a source of vernacular and regionality.
Thanks, Ankita. I mean, it's very interesting that different kinds of programs, whether it is a shopping center or a hotel, all of them have the same type of single loaded corridor. And how do we kind of understand this new type that is coming up? And I mean, there were some photographs that you showed us, which were also many buildings that often are half constructed. You know, you invest in the building, you put 1 foot inside the making of a building, another foot in terms of money in doing something else, and you wait for the right opportunity. Very interesting to kind of see. This thing completely changes how architects have been talking about villages. So I mean, what kind of is very kind, what I find common as a strand of discussion amongst all the three presentations over here, start with Ashi and her focus on different kinds of spatial configurations that produce um, commons, and Ankita's focus on the nimbleness with which buildings need to adapt. Both of them are kind of, in a certain sense, talking of, when Ashi speaks about blurring and Ankita speaks about the nimble adaptations of a building type, they're speaking about a temporal change of use, whether it is everyday temporality or over longer time, over a longer period of time. So there is a sense of time and space that plays out at the edges of streets. And Abhinav kind of, asks questions that particularly if, architects or urban designers who have posed ideas of paths, nodes, landmarks, edges, and precincts or districts work only for pedestrians, but not for vehicular traffic. How might we think through faster speeds? With this kind of summary, I'll kind of open up the discussion for conversation. I'd first like to invite Kush because he's joined us now, followed by Sarovar, and then we go to Vishwanath. Yes, so Kush. Or, I mean, if Kush, you want to take time, even the others can open up. So whoever wants to.
Yeah, Sarovar, Vishwanath, if you do have your notes and you're ready to jump in, please do. I mean, we can negotiate as much as students are talking about negotiations.
Fair enough, absolutely. Whoever is comfortable.
How do you feel, Sarovar?
I think Vishwanath should go first.
Okay. No, I don't mind at all. So the other thing I found common in this particular panel, and which was heartening to see, is that all three of you presented a very fine-grained sort of observation of the city itself, the streets of the city. And I think that sort of fine-grained documentation really helped us as someone who is just seeing your work for 10 minutes. It helped us really get into what you're trying to do. So I would like to commend all three on that. Now, this whole idea of mobility and city, of course, is a topic which has interested people since quite a few decades, I must say, right now. If I comment on each of the three of them in order to paint a larger picture, in the first work, Ashi, what I found really pertinent in your case probably is also maybe a discussion on the idea of commons as something different from the idea of public. At least the way I understand commons is that it is collective ownership, and collective could be at multiple scales. Uh, because someone could argue that in a democracy, public land is also collective ownership. But I think one needs to look at to what degree can you stretch this idea of collective ownership. And I was thinking that some sort of comparison between or some sort of comparison with shared spaces in a gated housing community, which is a very interesting form of collective ownership. Unfortunately, not probably perceived as commons, but that would have been interesting. So, to me, this and I was looking at your examples and the fine-grained negotiation that you were saying happens in each of the street when you are talking of the minority community and the bend in the street. So I would like you to comment on what is your understanding of the difference between the idea of the commons and the idea of the public. Um In the case of Abhinav, let me pick up where you ended by sort of commenting on the city, where you said that at low speed there is a certain spatiality that is achieved and the idea of negotiation, whereas at high speed it becomes a blur, and there's an externality and you're almost objectifying it. I think this sort of reading of the city has been made by people in the past. I do feel that, however, your observations are throwing up many more interesting possibilities of looking at what mobility does to the city. For example, at one point you said that depending on whether the person is talking on the phone or carrying heavy weight in their hands, their understanding of both mobility, how they move, and therefore what they perceive of, say, something like distance or crowd or the street itself changes, right? Which I thought, these kind of nuances I thought were very fascinating, because when people talk of mobility in city, there is a certain flattening of the idea of people moving in the city. It is assumed that all people moving at the same speed uh, perceive the city in a similar fashion. And right now, I think your concluding statement is doing that. It is clubbing people simply based on stationary versus mobile. Whereas I think you already have many more interesting sort of observations of uh, how people move and what they are thinking or how they are perceiving the city when they move. Uh, Now, I think, and coming to Ankita's study, uh, in a way it is talking of mobility, but I think it is talking of it from a very different perspective, in that the environment itself is different. And it's this insertion. I saw, at least in your sections, I could make out that at most places it was an elevated highway, right? So I'm assuming the original highway was on the ground and now it became elevated. Uh, I find that also quite fascinating. I quite some time back, I came across a study which was done on the Ahmedabad Baroda Expressway, which is not an elevated expressway; it is on the ground. But because it's an expressway, there is a continuous sort of railing on both sides of the expressway, and it completely splits people on this side to people on that side. It does what a river would do maybe hundreds of years back. So I did feel that maybe, just like you were elaborating in plan how what sort of difference the highway has created. Maybe if you could discuss a little bit in section also, what is the difference between what an elevated highway does to people around it as opposed to what a highway on the ground does to people around it. That differentiation would also bring out some very interesting aspects of what large scale infrastructure does to the city. Yeah.
I, can I go next, or if you want to go?
Yes, sir. Please.
So I'm going to be the anthropologist amongst the architects, and I'm going to ask you guys to. It's very interesting because I really loved the detailing that you all did in very different ways of movement, of the square, of people, of how multiple use. But I think there was this word called the spatial, which was so I found that all your work is about placemaking. It's whether it is through it's like kind of like the Ashi, in your work there's a lot of detail, and it is about the movement and the warp and weft of the of that space, which is so used by so many different kinds of people, how it folds into different things. how the idea of this kind of square, a common space, which can become so many things at different times of the year. And so there's a lot of place making in your thing, and I think the word spatial then like loses meaning in some sense. Similarly, Abhinav, your work was also very interesting. And I think this Nana Chowk is a very interesting and controversial point of Bombay, as far as I remember when it was made. And it has a very intense relationship with that structure of walking that has been inserted. It's like an elevated walking, I don't know, rhizome or something like, on top, it's like and it's like it has a particular look, and it also it has a kind of irritation to the people who are into the aesthetics of space and how the Nana Chowk used to look before, and also to the walkers themselves, because if you do Bombay trains or anything, this walking up the staircases and adding extra staircases is already a pain, So what would be interesting for you again is to think of densities of movement in this, which what I mean by densities of movement. Sorry, there are all these deluge values type words I use, but the densities of movement are essentially slowness, fastness. Rain walking and no rain walking is entirely different in Bombay. What route, what will you take a covered high walkway or a non-covered walkway? I mean, the splash and the puddle of walking is in Bombay is there in your face. Then also train timing, slowness and fastness, and how speed changes when you are going to work, and how speed changes when you're coming back from work. So in a sense, I found your relationship to mobility, and I think you had said this thing, and it's there in your abstract also. Sorry, I'm going to open your abstracts and tell you. The spatiality of urban mobilities, the shaping of experience of every day. I understand the second part. The first part I don't understand of your title. And I think it'll be interesting to think of it as maybe the densities of urban mobilities or the forms of urban mobilities, right? So वो जो spatial का obsession है वो थोड़ा कम कर सकते हैं if you want to. Then Ankita, I also found your piece very interesting. There is actually a play by Habib Tanveer called Sadak, which is about the coming of a highway. And it's kind of interface with a village from which it's going to pass. And that play, I don't know if the text is available online or somewhere. It's probably available in the NSD bookshop or something. It's very interesting. It has a lot of what you're trying to unpack of the highway and its interface with this place. And as Vishwanath was saying, it's also an elevated highway. What happens to the space below? Maybe a kind of analysis of how it is used or ignored, or does it create does that create a heterotopia for people? Does it become a place where, I don't know, people go to hide or do things which you're not allowed to do or whatever? So how has something which is appeared in their frame of horizon as a completely different use or relationship of interaction, and that would be interesting to look at. So I think I really liked your work. I liked your drawings. I'm calling them drawings. I know they're called sections and plans and everything. It'll be interesting because I think you guys have a lot of interesting data and it's very nice, Abhinav, that you used people's voices and stuff like that. It's really interesting. So yeah, I'm going to pass it over to Kush, who is the first person who's supposed to speak.
Thanks, Sarovar. So
thanks, Sarovar. Sorry, Rohit, were you saying something?
No, so I said thanks to Sarovar.
Yeah, great. So, I just wanted to say, Ashi, Abhinav, Ankita, I mean, thanks for walking us through your projects. There was such meticulousness in your observations that came through in how you drew and how you presented, and the ways in which you even wrote your narratives. And there was a flow to it. There was a comprehension, not just in terms of how you understood the project, but also calling us in, inviting us to be part of your observations. So I wanted to start with, on that note of congratulations. One of the questions that I have for all three of you is who are the publics of your project? And by that, I mean, how can we be even more fine-grained in terms of not just naming the people, but also the politics that these publics bring to each of your questions. And so for Ashi, the politics of commons, incredible observation of life as it's unfolding, and ways in which physical thresholds or interfaces are expanding, contracting, and or becoming something else through common use, through common ownership, and through sort of common even management of those spaces, which I was left to sort of, kind of imagine what that management of those spaces might be, because commons is about all three, right? Co-use, co-ownership, co-management of resources which are held in common, and then how they are constantly kind of made and remade over time. But one thing that I was left wondering is how you return to this idea of commons as a noun, as opposed to keeping it suspended as a verb. And so commons versus commoning, what that would allow you to do, Ankita, perhaps, is have your observations, which are currently from your eye and your perspective, to be juxtaposed with claims from the ground up. This is where the question of publics comes. So where commons, if you understand commons as political and highly contested and always in the making, and as a verb, as a kind of a space which cannot be necessarily drawn in its entirety, but always is information, then how do you lay claim and make visible those claims to commons by the people who are actually part of that fabric? And what that would do is allow your drawings to, as much meticulous and detailed as they are, to be messier, and allow you to then challenge some of the completeness of your own drawings. You would start kind of, having some restraint in places to be able to then exaggerate certain lines, which are either being erased through use or violent occupation of a particular use, or being consolidated through collective use. And that brings together a kind of an understanding of commons as it is commonly held, not because we all value the same, but necessarily in the context of a city, it's forever a question or an aspiration or a goal to achieve. So I think in that sense, it would be good to see then where does architecture come? And one way to begin to then see is that how do we then, because the conclusions were at the level of anonymity, largeness of space, these are all measurable architectural determinants, right? Which in some ways allows you to then have a spatial form. But then how do we return to this idea of topology? So geometry versus topology. Topology as a set of social relationships which are making the commons, which in turn brings in this idea of who are the publics. How are they coming together to create a kind of an infrastructure that is as much physical, but it's deeply social. And then what do those two drawings that you have done, or a series of drawings that you've done, how do they start becoming different? And start providing you with even more challenging insights about the role that space and architecture could begin to play in amplifying some of these attempts from the ground up. So then your role as an architect could become one that is not just facilitating an understanding of commons, but even amplifying threads that need to be amplified, or structuring them differently where they need to be structured differently. So that was one observation. With Abhinav, mobility, again, great visual presentation, sound files, the way you sort of literally, allowed us to travel with you on foot, sometimes in the car, and kind of traverse those streetscapes. But I couldn't help think that mobility is as much about, yes, movement, travel, speed, purposive action, going from one destination to the next, as it is about strategies of navigation, as it is about accessibility, as it is about the coming together of both accessibility and strategies of navigation in the shaping of one's sense perception in that space. So I think there is a possibility here to see how mobility studies intersect with disability studies, and how even again, this idea of publics, right? So you talk about all genders, but the genders are binary. You talk about all people, but then the people are all able-bodied. So it's a very ableist representation of mobility, a very ableist narration of mobility. And one can only sort of see how your project can be deepened with a much more careful layering of what does it mean to then lower speed, not by virtue of choice, but by virtue of the environment not affording us the possibility to even manage a speed. You see the difference? So it's one thing for us to say that we've lowered our speed because we're walking on a footpath and we are getting caught by a particular signage or a light in a store. But another thing for me as a disabled person to then say that I have no choice in my speed becoming slower because the affordances are not there, and or the mobility is not even considered, the cities are not designed for mobility of my sense perception to be accommodated. So I think there's an interesting sort of nuance to be had there, which will make it even more deeper and relevant for the questions that you're asking. Ankita, when I read your abstract, and even when I was listening to your presentation, absolutely brilliant set of questions of how a highway infrastructure is beginning to alter the inhabitation, the morphology of a particular land formation, right? So in this case, it's a rural land holding. It has had few built structures, and all of that is changing and will be changing rapidly given the intensity and pace of development that's happening on the highway. But then I again want to push you and say that how can we move beyond typology of buildings to land holdings, or the very commodification of land and the resulting transformation of use as a generator of architectural form. So I think there is a potential here to then not flatten out that there is an agricultural land and there is a building and there's a highway. But because you start with this idea of dispossession, I want you to return to that question of what does it mean to feel dispossessed by virtue of us not having control over our land. So again, land is a commodity. I think it connects back to Ashi's project of how do we move away from commodification to commoning, and in what physical and social manifestations do those ideas kind of land in our projects, so that the architectural resolutions are again not at the level of built form typology necessarily as a starting point, but explicitly political, because each of our projects are deeply political by virtue of them having very unique publics. So go back to this question of who are the publics? How do they own the space or manage the space or have access to the space? And in what ways are they opening up the possibility for you to then say, where is the role of architecture in space? In either amplifying, structuring, repairing, maintaining, caring for those infrastructures. So that's where I'll pause. So thank you.
Thanks, Kush. I mean, detailed set of comments from all of you, all the three of you. And so I'm just going to kind of invite Ashi, Abhinav, and Ankita to respond. I'll do one thing kind of just to make it easy on you all. There are a set of common comments that have been made. Let me just put those first for discussion. You may choose to respond to them, or you all can kind of take up individual comments that have come for your work. So all the three of them kind of focused on asking you all to elaborate or discuss a little further. What is your idea of commons versus the public? And if you could kind of build on this, it would be nice. So that is one. And the other one was about commons. What is commons and commoning? And Sarovar kind of asked about questions about how do we think of movement or mobility in terms of densities that are not in numbers but go beyond that kind of language. So these are the common comments that came up. You may choose to respond to this, but you can also choose to respond to the individual detailed comments, questions that came up. I leave it up to y'all. But just before that, just one thing I want to kind of respond to. So this highway that Ankita is kind of focusing on, it's not yet built, and that the flyover is actually a very small part where there is a settlement. It's not even built. This highway, I mean, this is an expressway that connects from Bombay to Trivandrum. It's kind of being built. Just wanted to kind of clarify that. Yeah. Any one of you.
I'll go. I mean, so just as a reply to this question about publics and commons, I'd just like to start at initially when I was actually looking at this idea of mobility, I wanted to, or at least I was trying to bring in this entire sort of a dimension of the identity, and how the identity essentially results in like these multiple different constructs of the city, as in how an individual's sort of routines of every day, and like you said, like Vishwanath also pointed out, like how if they are carrying a heavy sort of suitcase, how their perception of distance has a very different meaning from any other or any normal or someone else's perception of distance on the street. So while this was the endeavor to actually tie up both those sort of studies, in the sense the study from the streets and the study of the individual, and bring and tie those two together, and therefore answer this question of how you differentiate from the commons in the public. I think it was also very, like, as much as I'd like to be an unbiased observer, or this is just my, I mean, I'm not trying to be defensive, but I just observed that it was very difficult for me to enter a zone where I was able to to characterize or to judge, or not judge, but to, so if I did go through the process of actually taking interviews and like these long sort of, I documented like a person's everyday routine to understand what their affordances were and what their what the people they were communicating with on a daily basis, or the spaces they occupied. However, while on site or while getting them to do these interviews, the tie-up between these two was difficult to make as a researcher, because I just was unable to take a stand which was a little or was looking at this whole sort of spectrum, uh, uh, because I think it was also just like that veil was difficult to lift, and it was difficult to make those yeah.
Yes,
To
Ashi.
the to the question that how the idea of commons differs from the idea of public. So uh, uh, public spaces are always imagined to be as something which is for everyone, which is for all, which is for all the people, which is actually not possible, because not everyone has the accessibility. Whereas commons are resources which are shared by a specific community. So hence, like through I was what I was trying to I was hence I was using talking through the idea of commons, and I was talking about the politics of commons, like because commons are built through its politics of negotiations, and hence public is also a commons in most of the places. So yeah, the uh, like to the first question, like what is the difference between the commons, how does it differ from commons and public? and there is to the second one, actually, when Kush, you were talking, I lost network in the last where you were talking about the like you spoke about those three things, like there are these co-users which are, and ownership and management. And when you asked me that question, I got a network connection. So could you repeat the last question? Actually, I couldn't hear it.
Yeah, sure, Ashi. So what I was saying is that, you've done very kind of a thorough observation studies of the place. Can you hear me now? Are you able to hear me now?
Are you able to hear him, Ashi?
No. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I think there's a bit of a lag, so we'll just go with it. So what I'm saying is that your observations are very physical. The observations are about social life as it's unfolding in the spaces that you have selected. And your conclusions are also kind of very material in terms of it's allowing you as an architect to then imagine what are the parameters with which to even grapple with this idea of a design, a potential design. And what I was asking is that how about sort of thinking topologically in terms of the relationships between different groups of people and how those relationships are then mapping themselves out onto a drawing, or in your case, a kind of a plan form, which allows that drawing to not just have the entirety of life as it's taking place in a given hour or in a day, but really help you exaggerate certain conflicts or think about certain fractures or contestations. And then the drawing starts reading very different. So then you have two drawings, one which is through the lens of geometry, distant researcher, observer, observation studies, and understanding of commons as a verb, and all of that put together. And then there is another drawing which is coming from the ground up, where you actually inscribe the voices of the people, either methodologically or through their perspectives in popular media, what have you, but something that begins to tell you that the idea of commons, the notion of commons is always, it's never achieved. It's always in a process of being achieved. And if it is in the process of being achieved, then what would that drawing look like? And what that drawing would do is then, what is constant in that drawing are those relationships, the topologies that are created and creating a certain space. And the coming together of those two drawings would be remarkable for your next kind of semester's thesis project, because then you would be able to understand how the physical and the material and the political, they come together.
Just like so the way I tried to understand these layers, the layers which are the politics of commons. So the way I started, so the form which I chose to explore this was also through these stories, the format of stories and these dialogical scripts. So because when I started talking to people, like all of them in a very soft way were raising their voice that how do they want to claim their space, and then what are the restrictions which they feel, and then what are the conflicts which they have to face. And so like throughout the like so like I tried to do that. Like I mean I don't know, but yeah, but I get it what you're trying to क्या बोल रहे हो. But yeah, like that was that was a part of the entire process which I tried to do, like to like how do you like, and not the drawing but also how does the, for example, the text helps you to understand that like what are the like the voices which are being raised, that how would one understand that. So the drawings, I don't know if it was not very clear, but yeah, it was a part of the process. But yeah, I'll think about it.
Thanks. Ankita, you want to respond?
Yeah, so for the politics of commons and publics. In my case, when the highway was 2 lane, the private properties in the front part of the private properties were used by owners also, and by the shopkeepers also, and by the weekly entrepreneurs who used to come there over there for the Tuesday market. So that was the idea of common for me, that the private property was used by many people, and there is no distinct boundary between the public and the private. And now, because the highway is becoming the 4 lane highway and it is going to be elevated, the there is a there is a boundary that has come up, that this part is the private and this part is public. So there is no as I explained, there is no place for other people to use that property. Yeah.
Thanks. Thanks. I'd like to open it up. We're very short of time. I'd like to open up the panel for questions from the audience.
There is a question on the question and answer board, Rohit.
Yeah. I'll just look at it.
I think that's just for Ashi.
That is specifically for Ashi from Shreyansh Chordia. In your view, are these religious boundaries necessary, or do they just create more differences, creating insecurity? Ashi, you want to quickly respond?
Yeah, so like when I was talking about the differences, so I was not actually, so there is nothing like no difference here, because if there is no if there's no difference, then there is religion, and if there's no religion, then there is caste, and if not, so the tension exists because of religion, caste, gender, and there are a lot of things. So I was not defending differences here, but this is how spaces get formed. This is because of the boundaries. The spaces get the spaces get formed around it. So
yeah, Ashi is saying that these boundaries exist irrespective of our yes or no, and we need to understand their implications on space. Yeah, I'll open up the discussion to further questions and comments. So Prasad wants to kind of go first.
Yeah, I mean, what is interesting about Ashi's work is that to kind of destabilize the romance of the commons a little bit, to kind of destabilize in the sense that not necessarily in sharing, but in intense contested negotiations, that commons kind of gets produced actually. So it's that kind of a thought which kind of which was very interesting in Ashi's stories. But my point is slightly different. My point is and what Vishwanath also said, and all of you all were saying, the dynamics, the dynamics of social life that shaped form and space, and form and space, that further shape the dynamics, and all of it, like Ankita's story is very clear, the way infrastructure kind of shapes the social life subsequently, or even, and all three of them, whether it is Abhinav, how the backgrounds or the class of people kind of puts together a certain imagination of experience, or puts together an experience of infrastructure. I think the question that these three have been dealing with, and that is something which will keep coming throughout the symposium. How do you kind of grasp it as architects? What are the tool sets that you have? What are the ways in which you kind of do it? How do you kind of speculate from here, project from here, reflect from here? What are the language questions and stuff like that? And I think that is something which will keep coming, again and again, and it has come up in the previous two sessions, and again in this thing. The language question of how do you deal with those dynamics when you tell your story? Ashi is using the classical, miniature painting, referring to that. Abhinav is kind of looking at moving images and overlaps of collages. Ankita is kind of gone into analysis of architectural drawings and typologies, and all of them are still really struggling to talk about this forward and backward dynamics, which are so important for that space and form. And that question will keep coming up. That question will keep on coming, and it will kind of reappear again and again throughout this symposium. Upal, you want to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, two things. One is that, what this panel also kind of complicates for us is this idea of, generic ideas of both the commons and the public. Architectural discourse has this kind of, flattening in some ways, where we say, often it is the modern public. Like there is this, as if there is one public, and what these kind of do is complicate for us this idea of what public is. But the other thing also that all the three presentations bring to us is this kind of destabilizing of the stasis that that architecture otherwise is in. There is this almost sort of idea that things are fixed in time. But in some ways, you understand that, whether it's in Ashi's case, there is a kind of constant negotiation, a constant becoming that happens, whether it is in Ankita's case, this idea of an urbanism that is waiting to become, right? Or even in Abhinav's case, this idea of the interface that happens when in mobility. So what does it mean to then not be fixed in time, but to kind of be in some ways agile? And that's a question that is difficult for architecture to work with, but it's kind of, these are two very important questions that this panel is bringing up. What does it mean to not think of stasis, and to kind of not think of the idea of a public which is in some ways homogeneous, and sort of fixed in time. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you draw it also,
How do you draw it also?
Draw that fluxy moment, and which is kind of, and architecture depending so much on the idea of, permanence and stability, because architects have to kind of the drawing subsequently, then they have to write specifications on them, and then they kind of, they need.
We're losing you, Prasad. Can't hear you.
No, I'm saying that the drawing, how does architects and architectural students and everybody who's dealing with architecture kind of, deal with that fluxy, transformational, changing material, the dynamic thing? And that's a difficult question.
And I think this also ties back to, I think the modern drawing technique, especially orthography or even axonometric and isometric, is a drawing technique which has a fixed viewpoint, fixed gaze, which is very different from the miniature painting, for example, which does not fix the viewer. And I think we have become so used to the fixed viewpoint way of drawing. And the very fact that even our shop drawings or working drawings are a fixed gaze drawing makes it increasingly more difficult for us to engage with these questions of dynamics and flux.
Absolutely. The thing is that for the political economy, it is necessary to make fixed drawings. You can only draw tenders and specifications and rates and rate contracts if you have something fixed at one time. Life doesn't get fixed. That's the problem. And how does architects deal with this? It's a complex question.
Just one thing related to what Vishwanath is saying, that this tension of the location of the view is something, one of the things I've once made students from another architecture school where I used to teach do was I made them do a study of a hermeneutics of corners and rooftops. And what one did with that was to you had a material location, you had a fixity, but you kind of spun it around hermeneutics, right? So it wasn't, and I think what happens is the visual playing field of the architectural eye has kind of become so, because like I was looking at Ashi's drawings. In fact, I sent them to another faculty of mine who who teaches a course on space and place, and I was like, wow, look at the detailing in this and all. But that because the mind's eye, that architects develop, वो कहीं और पे टंगी हुई है, कभी ड्रोन बन जाती है, कभी कुछ और बन जाती है, तो वो आय जो है उसको काबू में लाना है थोड़ा. That's what I think. I think the material is there.
We'll see some of that tomorrow.
बाहर करना है सरोवर, वो काबू में है अभी, उसको काबू से बाहर करना है.
हाँ, maybe.
Professor, that's where this idea of the question of the publics is also important, because I think it's not just about publics as in publics who live in the city, but then who are the architects public? I mean, Giancarlo Di Carlo had raised this question in the 1960s, architects public, right? And that question is still an unanswered question, because, I mean, it's an answered question, but we don't answer it for ourselves. And then we kind of put ourselves in this idea of, again, yes, as you said, yes, the realities of a tender drawing or a construction drawing or what have you. But if the publics of your project are not the immediate sort of the technocrats, then liberate yourselves. Let us sort of really imagine different possibilities, and then if and when something has to be kind of materially take form and shape on the ground, then say, okay, where is that line to be drawn?
That's a nice entry point. That's a nice entry point, Kush. Yeah. I mean, entering it through the ethics. Who is the client? Who is your it's a nice entry point.
Yeah.
However, you'll see some of the hermeneutics of the corners and rooftops tomorrow, and the tightening of the frame. The kind of movement. We'll see some of those tomorrow.
I mean, one of the things that I in all the three cases, for instance, Abhinav tried to do his field work when we were in lockdown. So he literally had to catch people to put them in cars. Okay, it's a research that is produced during that time. So that creates a certain way in which the research gets produced. Or Ankita mobilizes her kinship networks to get photographs from which to make those drawings, or even get people to talk to her. She's not been there to the site. So, I mean, some of these questions which are very nice, like, for instance, Kush's questions of how do you move from the building type to the land holdings? How do you get to the people? Like the whole challenge has been, how do you mobilize connections to get an entry point when you're finding yourself at a distance? And that has been one of the struggles which I think, particularly Abhinav and Ankita faced in their work while doing this work. So that became a challenge. So where that challenge does not exist, it becomes a little easier to kind of break, to think of different or changing viewpoints. It becomes a little easier to kind of do that in a certain sense. It's 4:10, and we should kind of stop so that we can start the next panel on time. So thanks a lot for this lovely discussion and lovely set of presentations. We will continue in the next panel with discussions on streets. The next panel is titled as the many appearances of streets. So do join us for that. To all the attendees, we will begin at 4:30 sharp. And Rupali, you will take over the moderation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ashi, Abhinav, Ankita. Brilliant work. Thanks. Good luck. Yeah.
Thank you. See you.